simple cleaning woman was mocked for playing a worn violin for pennies in the park. Unaware the broken man she showed kindness to was a world-famous conductor who would change her life forever. That screeching sound. Is that supposed to be music? The rain hammered down on the grimy window pane of the tiny apartment, a relentless, mournful drumming that echoed the hollow ache in Alara Vance's soul. She pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around her son's small shoulders, the worn fabric a fragile shield against the biting cold that seeped through the cracks in the window frame. He slept on, his small face innocent and untroubled, a stark contrast to the storm of worry that raged within her. The room was cast in the flickering light of a single, cheap lamp, its amber hue making the shadows in the corners seem deeper, more menacing. Every object in the room spoke of their desperate poverty. The chipped mug on the peeling table, the faded photograph of her late husband, Daniel, his warm smile a ghostly presence, and the violin case resting in the corner like a sacred relic. It was Daniel's violin, the only thing of value they had left, and it was both her greatest comfort and her most profound burden. A week ago, she had been a cleaner at the prestigious Blackwood Academy of Music, a place of polished marble floors and cavernous concert halls that echoed with the soaring notes of genius. Now she was nothing, fired, discarded. Her crime had been a moment of human weakness, a brief pause in her scrubbing to listen to a student practicing a piece by Bach, a piece Daniel used to play for her. Madame Isolde Dubois, the Academy's headmistress, had found her standing there, mop forgotten in her hand, tears glistening in her haunted eyes. Madame Dubois's voice, as crisp and cold as a winter morning, had splintered the sacred silence. "We do not pay you to stand and weep like a sentimental fool, Miss Vance. We pay you to erase filth. It seems you have confused your station." The words had been delivered with a quiet, venomous precision, each one a perfectly aimed dart. Alara had tried to explain, her voice trembling, but the headmistress's eyes were like chips of ice. She was dismissed on the spot, her final paycheck docked for wasted time. Now, the last of that money was gone, spent on a small bag of rice and medicine for Leo's persistent cough. The eviction notice was tucked beneath the leg of the wobbly table, its stark, official letters a constant, screaming reminder of their impending doom. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. But then she would look at Leo, at the gentle rise and fall of his small chest, and a quiet resolve would settle over her. She would not shatter. For him, she would be unbreakable. She would take the violin to the park tomorrow. It was their only hope. The thought sent a tremor of shame and fear through her. To play Daniel's violin, his beautiful, beloved instrument, for a handful of scattered coins felt like a betrayal, felt like selling a piece of his soul. But her son's hunger was a more immediate, more visceral pain. She rose from the makeshift bed, her movements slow and weary, and crossed the small room. Her fingers, chapped and raw from years of harsh cleaning chemicals, gently traced the smooth, dark wood of the violin case. She could almost feel the warmth of Daniel's hands, hear his quiet chuckle as he taught her the first clumsy notes. He had believed in her talent, a secret, gentle thing she had nurtured only for him. "You have music in you, Alara," he used to whisper, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't ever let the world silence it." The world had done its best to do just that. It had taken him from her, taken her dignity, and now it threatened to take their home. She opened the case with a soft click. The violin lay nestled in the worn velvet, its wood gleaming even in the dim, flickering light. It seemed to hum with a life of its own, a repository of unspoken love and shattered dreams. She picked it up, the familiar weight a comfort in her hands. She wouldn't play for herself, or for Daniel's memory. She would play for Leo. She would transform her grief into something that could buy them one more meal, one more day. Her resolve hardened. She was a mother. She was a survivor. She was not just filth to be erased. She had music inside her. She would not be silenced. She closed her eyes, imagining the park, the indifferent faces of strangers, the humiliating clink of a coin in an open case. Her heart pounded. But then she pictured Leo's trusting smile, and the fear receded, replaced by an unwavering, desperate strength. The rain continued its relentless hammering. It was the sound of her world falling apart. But inside the tiny, cold room, a quiet, dignified woman held a violin and made a promise to the ghost of her husband and the future of her son. The music would not die. The next day, the sky was a canvas of bruised purple and gray, a heavy fog clinging to the city like a shroud. The park was nearly deserted, the damp air carrying a biting cold that seeped into Alara's bones despite her thin, threadbare coat. She found a spot beneath a large, skeletal oak tree, its bare branches reaching towards the oppressive sky like gnarled fingers. Leo sat beside her on the cold stone bench, wrapped in their only good blanket, his small hands clutching a worn wooden rattle Daniel had carved for him. He watched her with wide, serious eyes, his quiet presence a source of steady, grounding warmth in the face of her terror. Her hands trembled as she opened the violin case. The instrument felt alien in the harsh, open air, a fragile, intimate thing exposed to the world's casual cruelty. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and placed the violin beneath her chin. The first note she played was hesitant, a thin, wavering sound that was nearly swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the park. It was raw, imperfect, filled with the unspeakable grief and desperate hope that warred within her. A few passers-by glanced at her, their faces a mixture of pity and mild annoyance, before hurrying on their way. The coins in her open case remained stubbornly absent. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked at her eyes. She faltered, the bow scraping against the strings with a harsh, ugly sound. She was a fool. This was a mistake. Daniel's beautiful violin deserved better than this pathetic, public display of her desperation. She was about to pack it away, to surrender to the crushing weight of her failure, when she saw him. He was sitting on a bench across the path, a solitary figure seemingly carved from stone. He was dressed in simple, dark clothes that looked soaked through. His posture slumped in a way that spoke of a weariness that went far beyond the physical. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and he stared into the middle distance, completely oblivious to the world around him. A man so lost in his own private ocean of pain that the impending storm was of no consequence. Something about his profound loneliness resonated with her own. He was a kindred spirit in suffering, another soul set adrift in a cold, uncaring world. The narrator didn't know it yet, but this moment of unspoken connection would change everything. A sudden, fierce gust of wind tore through the park, carrying with it the first heavy drops of rain. People scattered, pulling up hoods and opening umbrellas. Alara quickly covered the violin with a small piece of plastic she'd brought, her first instinct to protect the precious instrument. Then she looked at Leo, ensuring the blanket was tucked securely around him. Her own coat was already becoming damp, the cold intensifying, but her gaze kept returning to the man on the bench. He hadn't moved. The rain began to fall in earnest now, a steady, chilling downpour, plastering his thin hair to his skull and soaking his simple jacket. He just sat there, accepting the deluge as if it were his due. A moment of internal hesitation seized Alara. She had nothing. Her son was cold. Her only shelter was a leaky roof she was about to lose. This man was a stranger. She owed him nothing. But then she saw the subtle trembling in his hands, the utter desolation in his posture, and her own suffering was momentarily eclipsed by a wave of pure, selfless empathy. She couldn't just leave him there. It wasn't in her nature. With a quiet resolve that pushed aside all logic, she made her decision. She picked up her own worn, slightly torn umbrella, the one she'd been saving to shield Leo on the walk home. She took the 3 lonely coins from her violin case and the small, slightly squashed sandwich she had wrapped in a napkin for Leo's lunch. She walked over to the stranger, her heart thudding with a strange mixture of fear and purpose. He didn't seem to notice her approach until she was standing directly in front of him. He looked up slowly, his eyes unfocused, as if seeing her through a thick pane of frosted glass. They were the saddest eyes she had ever seen, haunted by a loss so profound it seemed to have extinguished all light from within. "Sir," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You'll catch your death of cold out here." She held out the umbrella. He just stared at it, then at her, a flicker of confusion in his hollow gaze. "Please, take it," she insisted gently, opening it and holding it over his head. The rain immediately stopped hammering on his shoulders. He blinked, as if waking from a long, terrible dream. She then pressed the coins and the sandwich into his trembling hand. "It's not much," she whispered, a blush creeping up her cheeks. But no one should be hungry for a long moment. There was only the sound of the rain drumming on the fabric of the umbrella. The man, Alistair Sterling, though she did not know his name, simply stared at the meager offerings in his palm. The 3 small coins, the humble sandwich, the sincere, unwavering kindness in the eyes of the pale, fragile woman before him. A seismic shift occurred deep within him, a cracking of the ice that had encased his heart for 5 long years, ever since the accident that had claimed his wife and daughter. This woman, who clearly had nothing, was offering him everything she had, with no expectation of reward. It was an act of such pure, unadulterated goodness that it felt like a miracle in his cynical, transactional world. A sharp gasp of emotion caught in his throat. He tried to speak, to refuse, to ask her why, but the words wouldn't form. His voice, a tool he had once used to command entire orchestras, had vanished. Alara saw the raw emotion shimmering in his eyes and mistook it for something else. She gave him a small, sad smile. "Don't worry," she said softly. "My son and I will be fine. We don't live far." She backed away, leaving him holding the umbrella, and hurried back to Leo. She scooped her son into her arms, pulling the blanket tight around them both, and began the walk home, the cold rain soaking her thin coat and hair almost instantly. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She had just given away their last few coins and their only food. It was a reckless, foolish act. Yet, strangely, her heart felt lighter than it had in months. Alistair sat frozen, the umbrella held aloft by a hand that felt disconnected from his body. He watched her go, a small, retreating figure swallowed by the gray mist. Total silence descended upon his world, broken only by the steady rhythm of the rain. She was gone. The walk home was a blur of biting cold and relentless rain. By the time Alara and Leo stumbled back into their small, damp apartment, she was soaked to the bone, her body racked with shivers she couldn't control. She quickly stripped Leo of his damp outer clothes and wrapped him in the driest blanket she could find, her own chattering teeth making it difficult to speak reassuringly. That night, a fever took hold of her. It was a vicious, consuming fire that left her weak and disoriented, drifting in and out of feverish dreams filled with the sound of screeching tires and Daniel's fading smile. For 3 days, she was barely able to move, her world shrinking to the confines of the lumpy mattress on the floor. Leo, with the preternatural seriousness of a child forced to grow up too soon, became her tiny caretaker. He brought her sips of water from a chipped cup and sat beside her, his small hand resting on her forehead, his presence a silent, unwavering vigil. The last of the rice was gone. The landlord's final, angry note had been shoved under the door, its red ink bleeding like a fresh wound. They were to be out by the end of the week. The desperation she had held at bay now flooded in, a suffocating tide. Her body ached, her head throbbed, but the pain in her heart was the most unbearable of all. She had failed. She had failed Daniel. She had failed Leo. The act of kindness in the park, which had felt so right in the moment, now seemed like the height of foolishness, the final, naive mistake that had sealed their fate. She had given away their last hope to a stranger, and now they had nothing. She closed her eyes, a single hot tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. The world was a place of sharp edges, just as she had always feared, and her softness had finally been her undoing. Meanwhile, across the city, Alistair Sterling sat in the sterile silence of his cavernous mansion. The umbrella she had given him stood drying by the ornate, unlit fireplace, a stark, humble object amidst the polished marble and priceless art. It was a relic from another world, a world of sincere human connection he had long since forgotten. For 5 years since the crash, he had existed in a state of self-imposed exile, a ghost haunting the opulent tomb he had built for his family. He had surrounded himself with wealth and silence, believing he was beyond feeling, beyond hope. But the woman in the park had shattered his carefully constructed fortress of grief. Her selfless act, her quiet dignity in the face of what was clearly profound hardship, had reawakened something in him. It was a painful, unfamiliar sensation, like a long dormant limb slowly, agonizingly returning to life. He couldn't get her haunted, gentle eyes out of his mind. He couldn't forget the feel of the 3 small coins, warm from her hand, resting in his own. He had spent days and a days, the encounter playing over and over in his mind. He was the great Alistair Sterling, a man whose wealth could move mountains, whose name commanded respect in every corner of the globe. And he had stood there, mute and helpless, as a destitute woman gave him her son's lunch. The shame was a physical blow. He had been so consumed by his own loss that he had become blind to the suffering of others. He had become one of the indifferent faces in the crowd. Her kindness was not just a gift. It was an indictment. He had to find her. He had to repay her. It was more than a desire. It became a burning, all-consuming purpose, the first he had felt in half a decade. He made a single phone call. His head of security, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient man named Marcus, was in his study within the hour. "I need you to find someone," Alistair said, his voice rusty from disuse. He described the woman, the child, the violin, the park. He gave Marcus the umbrella. "Check the fabric, the handle, anything. I want to know everything about her." Marcus, ever the professional, showed no surprise. Within 24 hours, he returned with a slim file. Alara Vance, widow, son, Leo, age 5, recently fired from the Blackwood Academy, facing eviction. The details were a litany of suffering that made Alistair's chest tighten. He read the report, his hands clenching the crisp paper. The address was a tenement building in the city's poorest district. He saw a photograph of her, taken from a distance, her face pale and weary, and his resolve hardened into something adamantine. He would not simply repay her. He would save her. But he couldn't just appear, a wealthy benefactor from on high. That would be an intrusion, a violation of the pure, selfless spirit of her gift. It would turn her sacred act into a transaction. He had to move carefully from the shadows. His first act was anonymous. A wire transfer was made to her landlord's bank account, covering her rent for the next 6 months. The eviction notice would simply vanish. The next day, a delivery truck, unmarked and plain, left several large boxes outside her apartment door before dawn. They were filled with groceries, warm blankets, new clothes for both her and Leo, and a supply of the best children's medicine money could buy. A few days later, a thick, warm winter coat, impeccably made but with no designer label, was delivered from a non-existent sender. Alistair watched from a sleek, black car parked at the end of her street, the tinted windows obscuring him from view. He saw her open the door, her look of utter, stunned disbelief as she discovered the boxes. He saw her clutch the new coat, her shoulders shaking with what he knew were tears of relief. A profound, cathartic warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead. He was not just giving her things, he was giving her respite. He was giving her hope. And in doing so, he felt a flicker of his own hope returning. The separation had been necessary, but it was over. He knew he had to see her again, to speak to her, not as a savior, but as a man. The man she had shown such profound kindness to. He had to know the woman with the music in her soul. A week later, the fever had broken and Alara's world had been inexplicably transformed. The threat of eviction had vanished. The landlord suddenly apologetic and kind. Their cupboards were full, their small apartment was warm, and Leo was bundled in a new coat so soft it felt like a hug. It was a miracle, a baffling, anonymous act of charity that left her breathless with gratitude and confusion. She had no idea where it had come from, but it had given her a chance to breathe, to think beyond the next meal. The quiet resolve returned, stronger than before. She felt a renewed sense of purpose. She owed it to this unknown benefactor, and to herself, to not let this chance go to waste. She started practicing the violin again, not with desperation, but with a quiet, focused joy. The music that filled the small apartment was no longer just a lament of her grief. It held a new note of hope, a tentative but growing melody of resilience. She decided to return to the park, not to beg for coins, but simply to play. The park was now bathed in the soft, golden glow of a late autumn sun. The air was crisp and clean. She found her usual spot beneath the oak tree and began to play a gentle, lyrical piece by Schubert. She closed her eyes, losing herself in the music, in the feeling of the bow gliding across the strings. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice the man who approached and sat on the bench opposite her. The same bench where he had sat during the storm. It was Alistair. He was dressed simply again, but this time he looked less like a ghost and more like a man. The hollow look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet intensity as he watched her, listening with an unwavering focus that made her feel truly seen. When she finished the piece, the final note hanging in the still air, she opened her eyes and saw him. She gasped, her heart giving a sudden lurch. It was the man from the storm. He gave her a small, tentative smile. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. It was the first time she had heard him speak. Thank you," she stammered, a flush rising on her cheeks. "I'm Al," he said, omitting his last name. "We met, briefly, during the rain." "I remember," she said softly. "Are you all right? You were so soaked." The sincere concern in her voice touched him deeply. "I am now, thanks to you," he said. "I never got to thank you properly. You disappeared before I could." "There was nothing to thank me for," she said, looking down at her hands. He knew he had to tread carefully. "I was hoping," he began, his tone casual, "that I might repay your kindness with a cup of hot tea. It's the least I can do." The still quite chilly Elara hesitated. Her instincts told her to be wary of strangers, but there was a gentleness in his eyes, a shared sadness that she recognized. She found herself nodding. They went to a small, quiet cafe nearby. Leo, initially shy, was quickly won over when Alistair bought him a large hot chocolate with whipped cream. They sat in a dimly lit booth, the air filled with the comforting scent of coffee and cinnamon. The conversation started slowly, awkwardly, but soon found a natural rhythm. He asked about her violin, and she found herself telling him about Daniel, about his love for music and his belief in her. For the first time since his death, she spoke of him to a stranger, and it felt less like opening a wound and more like sharing a sacred memory. Alistair listened with a steady, empathetic gaze, his silence more comforting than any empty platitude could ever be. He didn't offer condolences. He simply listened, creating a safe space for her grief. Then, in a moment of vulnerability, he spoke of his own loss. "I lost my family," he said, his voice cracking almost imperceptibly. "My wife, Amelia, and my daughter, Lily. It was a car accident. 5 years ago." He looked down at the polished table, his reflection a distorted mask of pain. Elara's heart went out to him. She saw the same unbearable ache in his eyes that she saw in her own reflection every morning. The bond between them deepened, forged not in shared joy, but in the crucible of shared tragedy. "My Amelia," Alistair continued, his voice barely a whisper. "She loved the violin. She was a cellist herself, but she always said the violin was the voice of the human heart. She would have loved your playing." A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Elara reached across the table, her hand gently covering his. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of comfort, a bridge across their two solitudes. The physical contact was like a small electric shock to them both, a spark of warmth in the cold. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and the words were not a platitude. They were a profound, heartfelt acknowledgement of his pain. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, they were no longer just two strangers. They were survivors, two shattered halves of a whole, who had found a flicker of understanding in each other's presence. He didn't tell her who he was. He didn't tell her about the anonymous gifts. He just let her see the man, the grieving husband and father. He wanted her to know Al before she ever met Alistair Sterling. Over the next few weeks, they met often. He would find her in the park, or they would go for walks, talking for hours. He learned about her dream of one day playing in a real concert hall, a dream she spoke of as a fanciful, impossible thing. He saw the fierce, protective love she had for Leo, and he fell quietly, irrevocably in love with her pure heart, her gentle strength, and the beautiful, sad music she made. The more time he spent with her, the more the ice around his own heart melted away. The cavernous mansion felt less like a tomb and more like an empty house waiting to be filled with life. He was beginning to heal, and he knew, with an undeniable certainty, that Elara Vance was the reason. He also knew that the time for secrets was coming to an end. He had to find a way to give her the life she deserved, to make her impossible dream a reality. And that would mean revealing the truth. The annual Blackwood Patrons Gala was the most prestigious event in the city's cultural calendar, a glittering affair of old money and artistic aristocracy held within the Academy's ornate, cavernous Grand Hall. Alistair, knowing it was time, had gently encouraged Elara to go. "Just play outside," he had suggested, framing it as a way to be heard by influential people. "Your music deserves a bigger stage than the park." He didn't tell her that he would be there, or that he was, in fact, the single largest patron the Academy had. He wanted to see what would happen. He wanted the world to see her for who she was, not what she had. Filled with a new, tentative confidence fostered by Alistair's unwavering belief in her, Elara agreed. She dressed in her best, a simple but clean dark dress that had been among the anonymous gifts. Holding her violin case, she walked towards the Academy, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The entrance was a dazzling spectacle of gleaming limousines and flashing cameras. Men in crisp tuxedos and women in ornate gowns swept past her, their laughter like the tinkling of crystal chandeliers. She was invisible to them, a pale ghost on the periphery of their gilded world. She found a spot on the wide, polished marble steps, a little away from the main entrance, and took out her violin. Her hands were trembling, but she took a deep breath, picturing Alistair's kind, steady eyes. She began to play, not a sad lament, but a fiery, passionate piece by Paganini, a torrent of notes that demanded to be heard. The music, filled with all her pain, resilience, and newfound hope, was breathtaking. A few guests paused on their way in, their polite smiles turning to expressions of genuine surprise. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the raw, undeniable talent pouring from the worn instrument. For a fleeting moment, Elara felt a surge of triumph. They were listening. They were really listening. And then, a voice, sharp and cold as splintered ice, cut through the air. "What is the meaning of this?" Madame Isolde Dubois stood at the top of the steps, her posture rigid with indignation, her face a mask of pure contempt. Her eyes, like chips of obsidian, narrowed as she recognized Elara. "You," she hissed, the word dripping with venom. "The cleaner," the crowd murmured, their curiosity turning to cruel amusement. Madame Dubois descended the steps like a queen passing judgment, her movements slow and deliberate. She stopped directly in front of Elara, looking down her nose at the simple dress, the worn violin, the woman she had so casually discarded. "So this is what you've been reduced to? Begging on the steps of the very institution that had the good sense to throw you out," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "That screeching sound, is that supposed to be music? Sounds like a dying cat. You are filth, and you are soiling the very air of my Academy." Elara froze, the bow slipping from her trembling fingers. The blood drained from her face. Every cruel word was a physical blow, shattering her fragile confidence. The onlookers snickered, their faces a gallery of smug superiority. Public humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. She remained dignified, her back straight, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She felt small, worthless, exactly as Madame Dubois intended. "Security!" the headmistress called, a triumphant sneer on her lips. "Remove this person from the premises immediately." Two large security guards began to advance on her. Alara clutched her violin to her chest, a last, desperate act of protection. She was trapped, cornered, and utterly alone. But she was not alone. Just as the guards reached for her arm, a sleek, black car pulled up to the curb, its arrival silent and commanding. The chauffeur opened the rear door, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in an impeccable, custom-tailored tuxedo, his presence radiating an aura of calm, absolute power that instantly silenced the crowd. He moved with an unhurried grace, his polished shoes making no sound on the marble steps. The light from the grand entrance caught his face, and a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. It was Alistair Sterling, the reclusive billionaire, the legendary conductor, the man who had vanished from public life 5 years ago. Madame Dubois's jaw dropped. Her sneer was replaced by a look of utter, fawning shock. "Mr. Sterling," she gushed, rushing forward. "What an unexpected honor. We had no idea you would be gracing us with your presence." Alistair ignored her completely. His eyes, now blazing with a cold, protective fire, were fixed only on Alara. He walked past the stunned headmistress as if she were a piece of furniture and stopped in front of the trembling violinist. He gently took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Are you all right, Alara?" he asked softly, his voice a low, intimate sound meant only for her. She could only stare at him, her mind reeling in disbelief. "Al? Here? Looking like this?" The name Mr. Sterling echoed in her head. Couldn't be. He then turned to face the stunned crowd, his arm protectively around Alara's shoulders. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried an undeniable authority that commanded total silence. "My name is Alistair Sterling," he began, his gaze sweeping over the assembled patrons before finally landing, with chilling intensity, on Madame Dubois. "For the past 10 years, I have been the primary benefactor of this academy. It was my funding that built this new wing. It is my endowment that pays for your scholarships, your instruments, and, Madame Dubois, your very generous salary." The headmistress turned a ghastly shade of pale. "This woman," Alistair continued, his voice ringing with conviction as he drew Alara closer, "is Alara Vance. And you are correct about one thing, madam. She is not a cleaner. She is an artist of profound, raw, and honest talent. The kind of talent this institution was built to nurture, not to mock and discard." He then looked out at the silent, shamed faces of the crowd. "You all stood here and listened. You listened as a woman of immense dignity was publicly humiliated. You listened to her music, and then you listened to the cruel words of a bully, and you did nothing. You mistook poverty for a lack of worth. You mistook a worn instrument for a lack of talent. You are not patrons of the arts. You are merely consumers of it." The silence was absolute, heavy with shame. Alistair's gaze returned to Madame Dubois, and it was utterly unforgiving. "You speak of filth, madam. The only filth I see here tonight is the elitism, the cruelty, and the profound lack of humanity you have just displayed. You are a disgrace to the name of this academy and to the very spirit of music. As of this moment, your employment is terminated." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Madame Dubois looked as though she had been struck by lightning. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Alistair completely reversed the power dynamic, leaving her speechless and stripped of her authority in front of the very people she sought to impress. He had performed the most heroic public defense. He had saved her. The immediate aftermath of Alistair's declaration was a scene of stunned, frozen silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Madame Dubois stood as if turned to stone, her face a mottled canvas of shock, rage, and utter humiliation. The wealthy patrons who had been snickering moments before now avoided each other's eyes. Their amusement curdled into a thick, collective shame. The two security guards had retreated, melting back into the shadows. In the center of it all stood Alistair, a commanding pillar of strength, his arm still securely around Alara. She was trembling, not from cold or fear, but from the seismic shock of it all. Her mind struggled to connect the two images. Al, the kind, grieving man who drank tea with her in a quiet cafe, and Alistair Sterling, the legendary, powerful figure who had just brought the city's elite to a standstill. They were the same person. The anonymous gifts, the paid rent, the warm coat. It had all been him. The realization dawned on her, not with a gentle glow, but like a flash of lightning, illuminating everything with a stark, overwhelming clarity. He had been watching over her, protecting her all along. Her knees felt weak. She leaned against him, the solidness of his chest a grounding force in her spinning world. He looked down at her, his fiery public anger replaced by a look of infinite, tender concern. "Let's get you out of here," he whispered, his voice for her alone. He guided her away from the gawking crowd, past the disgraced Madame Dubois, and towards the waiting car. The chauffeur held the door open, and Alistair helped her inside, settling in beside her and pulling a soft cashmere blanket from the seat to wrap around her shoulders. The car pulled away from the curb with a smooth, silent grace, leaving the glittering facade of the academy and its sordid drama behind. Inside the vehicle, the world was hushed and warm. The city lights slid past the tinted windows, a blur of color and motion. Alara stared at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and unspoken questions. Alistair, she began, her voice barely audible. "I don't understand," he turned to her, his expression gentle. "I know this is a lot to take in, Alara. I should have told you sooner." "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" she echoed, looking up at him, her eyes wide. You saved me. You saved me first," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "That day in the park. I was lost. I hadn't felt anything but grief for 5 years. I was just an empty shell. And then you, who had every reason to be bitter and angry at the world, showed me a kindness so pure, so selfless. You reminded me what it felt like to be human again. You gave me a reason to want to live, not just exist." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, tears of confusion, gratitude, and a dawning, heart-stopping hope. He reached out and gently brushed one away with his thumb. "Everything that happened afterwards, the rent, the groceries, that wasn't charity, Alara. It was repayment for a debt I can never truly repay. It was me trying, in my own clumsy way, to give back a fraction of the light you gave to me." The car slowed to a stop, not in front of her tenement building, but before a stately, elegant townhouse in a quiet, tree-lined square. "Where are we?" she asked. "This is a place I keep in the city," he explained. "It's quiet. I thought we could talk inside." The house was a sanctuary of warmth and understated elegance. A fire was already crackling in the hearth of a beautifully appointed living room. Alistair led her to a plush sofa, then went to the kitchen. He returned a few minutes later with 2 mugs of steaming tea, just as he had in the cafe. The simple, familiar gesture helped to calm her racing heart. He sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I know you have questions," he said softly. "Ask me anything," and so she did. She asked about his life, his wife and daughter, his music. He answered every question with a raw, unflinching honesty. He told her about his decision to retreat from the world, his guilt, his profound loneliness. He laid his shattered heart bare for her. In turn, she found herself speaking more freely than she ever had before, telling him about her deepest fears for Leo, her secret, almost extinguished dream of playing her music for people who would truly hear it. As they talked, the last barriers between them dissolved. The powerful benefactor and the destitute violinist vanished, leaving only 2 people, Alistair and Alara, bound by a shared understanding of loss and a burgeoning, undeniable connection. Finally, after a long, comfortable silence, Alistair set down his mug and turned to face her fully. His eyes were serious, filled with a deep, unwavering sincerity. "Alara," he began, his voice low and steady, "when I defended you tonight, it wasn't just because I believe in your talent, though I do with all my heart. I announced that I am sponsoring a concert for you, At the Royal Concert Hall with a full orchestra. Your dream is going to come true, Alara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The Royal Concert Hall. It was the most prestigious venue in the country. It was an impossible dream. But that's not the most important thing I have to say, he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. I did what I did tonight because in these past few weeks, I have come to care for you more than I ever thought I could care for anyone again. You are the kindest, strongest, most dignified person I have ever met. You see the world not for what it is, but for what it could be. You have healed something in me that I thought was broken forever. He moved closer, taking her hand in both of his. His touch was warm, firm, and incredibly gentle. Alara Vance, he said, his voice cracking with the depth of his emotion. I think I'm falling in love with you. The declaration hung in the quiet room, as beautiful and fragile as a perfect, sustained note. All the hardship, all the suffering, all the lonely nights faded away. In their place was this man, this incredible, kind man, offering her not just security, but a love she thought she would never know again. Tears streamed freely down her face now, but they were tears of catharsis, of hope, of profound, overwhelming joy. Alistair, she whispered, her voice trembling, I think I'm falling in love with you, too. He smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached his eyes and transformed his handsome, sad face into something breathtakingly beautiful. And then, slowly, gently, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss that sealed a promise of a new beginning, a shared future where the ghosts of their pasts could finally be laid to rest, and where their two broken melodies could finally become a single, harmonious symphony. 1 year later, the biting cold and heavy fog of the previous autumn were a distant memory, replaced by the brilliant, golden sunlight of a perfect afternoon. The light streamed through the vast, floor-to-ceiling windows of a beautiful, stately home nestled in the countryside, illuminating a living room filled with warmth, laughter, and music. The room was not the sterile, museum-like space of Alistair's former mansion, but a true home, filled with comfortable furniture, shelves overflowing with books, and Leo's colorful toys scattered happily across a soft, plush rug. Alara stood by the window, a violin tucked under her chin. She was no longer the pale, haunted woman from the park. Her face was full of life and color, her eyes clear and bright with a deep, abiding happiness. The simple, worn dress had been replaced by an elegant but comfortable cashmere sweater. She was now Alara Vance Sterling, a celebrated concert violinist whose debut performance at the Royal Concert Hall had been met with thunderous standing ovations and rave reviews that praised her achingly pure and profoundly emotional talent. She had taken the music world by storm, not because of her connection to Alistair Sterling, but because of the undeniable power of her gift, a gift that had been forged in hardship and polished by love. She played a soft, joyful melody, a tune of her own composition. It was a song of gratitude, of new beginnings. As she played, Leo, now a healthy, vibrant 6-year-old, ran across the room and threw his arms around her legs, giggling. She stopped playing and leaned down to kiss the top of his head, her heart swelling with a love so fierce and complete it almost hurt. Alistair sat at the gleaming grand piano in the corner of the room, watching them. The hollow, haunted look was gone forever, replaced by a serene, contented warmth. He was no longer a recluse. He had returned to the world, selectively conducting again, but his true focus was his new family. He had found more joy in teaching Leo his first clumsy notes on the piano and listening to Alara practice than he ever had in the adulation of thousands. He caught her eye and smiled, a smile of such profound love and admiration that it made her breath catch. He began to play the piano, weaving a gentle, harmonious countermelody around the notes of her violin. Their music filled the sun-drenched room, a perfect duet. It was the sound of two healed hearts, two lives made whole. They had built a life together, a sanctuary of love and understanding, far from the cruel judgments of people like Madame Du Bois, who had faded into obscurity after her public disgrace. Their days were filled with simple, profound joys. Walks in the woods, picnics by the lake, and evenings spent by the fire, sharing stories and making music. They had found in each other not just a partner, but a soulmate, a fellow survivor who understood the depths of loss and, therefore, could truly appreciate the miracle of their shared happiness. Leo ran from his mother to Alistair, climbing onto the piano bench beside the man he now called Papa. Alistair wrapped an arm around him without missing a note, his fingers dancing over the keys. Elara raised her violin again and joined in, her music soaring to meet his. Looking at her husband and her son, bathed in the golden glow of the afternoon sun, her heart was overcome with a feeling of peace so deep it felt sacred. She had been through the darkest of nights, had faced despair and humiliation, but she had never let it extinguish the quiet, dignified music within her soul. And because of one selfless act of kindness, born from the purest part of her heart, she had not only saved herself and her son, but she had also saved the man who was now the center of her world. Their life together was a testament to the idea that the greatest strength is often found in gentleness, and the most profound love can be born from the deepest sorrow. The music swelled, a beautiful, triumphant symphony of a family reborn from the ashes of grief. A happily ever after that was more real and more precious than any fairy tale. This story is a testament to the enduring power of human kindness and the idea that a person's true worth is not measured by their wealth or status, but by the contents of their heart. Elara, in her moment of deepest desperation, performed an act of pure, selfless generosity for a stranger, without any thought of reward. That single act became a ripple that transformed not only her own life but the life of a man who had lost all hope. It reminds us that behind every face, there is a story of struggle and of strength, and that compassion is a universal language that can heal the most shattered of souls. It is a fable of redemption, showing that even a heart encased in the ice of grief can be thawed by the warmth of a simple, sincere connection, and that true love is about seeing the music within someone, even when the world around them is silent. If this story touched your heart and reaffirmed your faith in the power of goodness, please let us know. We believe that stories like Elara and Alistair's are more than just entertainment. They are reminders of the light that exists in the world, often in the most unexpected places. We invite you to like, share, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales for more soul-stirring stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love. Click the notification bell so you never miss